They say the happiest day in a woman's life is her wedding day. But for Violet Hayes, that day felt more like a public trial, one where she stood accused of mistakes she had never committed. On the very day she was meant to marry the man she loved, his family turned the ceremony into an open humiliation. Insults replaced vows, laughter replaced respect, and those who should have protected her stood aside and simply watched. What they didn't know, what no one in that cathedral could have imagined, was that Violet was not who they thought she was. And when the truth finally walked through those doors, it didn't just end a wedding, it shattered an entire world, built on arrogance and cruelty. This story is a powerful reminder to treat every person with dignity, because you never truly know who is standing in front of you. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more real and meaningful stories like this one. Violet Hayes learned early that strength does not need to announce itself loudly. It can exist quietly, in the way someone wakes before dawn without complaint, in the way a room is left cleaner than it was found, in the way words are chosen carefully and spoken only when necessary. She grew up believing that dignity is not something given by others, but something you carry within yourself and protect through discipline and restraint. Her childhood home in Montgomery, Alabama, sat on a quiet street where mornings always began with the same familiar sounds: the soft clatter of metal storefront gates opening nearby, the distant hum of city bus passing, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the neighborhood bakery. Inside the house, nothing was loud. The furniture was simple and solid, chosen for use rather than display. The walls were free of excess decoration. Only a few carefully placed family photographs, which Naomi Hayes, her mother, cleaned regularly. Her father, Raymond Hayes, was a man whose presence was felt without being imposed. He spoke little, listened carefully, and never repeated himself. People in Montgomery knew his name, but rarely his face. He left early each morning and returned in the evening with the same calm expression, greeting his family with a nod or a brief question about their day. His wealth, built patiently over decades through logistics, construction materials, and long-term investments, was invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look closely. He wore the same style of coat every winter, drove an ordinary car, and never spoke about business at the dinner table. Naomi Hayes was the quiet center of the family. She measured life not by ambition, but by balance. Meals were prepared slowly and with intention. Spinach pie or cheese pie sat on the table beside yogurt and olives. Soup simmered long enough to soften both the vegetables and the worries of the day. Naomi believed food carried emotion, and that a calm home shaped calm people. She taught Violet that listening is more powerful than reacting, and that self-respect is shown through consistency, not confrontation. Growing up in that environment, Violet learned routine as a way to stay grounded. She woke early, made her bed carefully, and helped her mother without being asked. She studied diligently, not out of pressure, but out of habit. Praise was rare in the Hayes household, but expectations were clear. Do your work well. Treat people fairly. Do not draw unnecessary attention to yourself. When it came time for college, Violet left Montgomery quietly. She enrolled in business economics and administration at University in Chicago, not for prestige, but because it offered the independence she wanted. Raymond supported the decision with few words. Naomi packed a small suitcase and slipped a handwritten note into her pocket, reminding her to eat properly and sleep enough. Violet rented a modest apartment near Hyde Park, close enough to walk to campus, but far enough from student noise to focus. The apartment was small, with light-colored walls and a narrow balcony overlooking a side street. She furnished it gradually, buying only what she needed: a desk by the window, a bookshelf, a kettle that whistled softly in the mornings. It was a place built for thinking, not for impressing. At university, Violet never sought attention. She sat in the front rows, kept precise notes, and asked questions only when something didn't align logically. Professors noticed her quickly. She connected concepts with ease, seeing links between theory and practice others missed. She didn't dominate discussions, but when she spoke, the room grew quiet. Her evenings followed a steady rhythm. After classes, she often went to the library, choosing a table near the economics section where the light was warm and steady. She studied for hours without noticing time, stopping only to drink tea or stretch her fingers. Her notes were exact, handwritten neatly, organized by thought rather than chapter. She didn't memorize. She understood. Occasionally, she allowed herself a break at a small cafe nearby, a place with mismatched chairs, low conversations, and a heavy scent of strong coffee lingering in the air. She always ordered the same thing and sat by the window, observing more than participating. She wasn't lonely, just selective. Noise distracted her. Drama exhausted her. Despite her age, Violet carried a seriousness that came not from sadness, but from clarity. She didn't romanticize hardship, nor did she idealize love. She believed relationships were built on effort, respect, and shared responsibility. Fairy tales held no interest for her. Partnership to Violet meant walking beside someone, not behind them, and not ahead of them. She spoke regularly with her parents, but briefly. Raymond never asked intrusive questions. Naomi always asked if she was eating well. They trusted her judgment, and that trust gave Violet stability. She lived intentionally anonymous. No one at the university knew her family background, and she made no effort to correct assumptions. She liked being evaluated solely on her work. By her third year, her academic reputation was solid. Professors recommended her for projects and internships. Other students quietly asked for her help, often surprised by her willingness to explain without condescension. She didn't enjoy admiration, but she valued honest ways of being useful. Emotionally, Violet felt steady. Her life was controlled, predictable, and deliberately simple. She knew who she was and what she stood for. She believed that if something meaningful would enter her life, it would come naturally, without force and without performance. She didn't know that someone had already begun to notice her, not because of her simple clothes or quiet presence, but because of the way her mind worked, the way she listened, the fact that she never tried to impress. Someone from a world built on ambition and appearance, drawn to her not because she belonged to that world, but because she clearly did not. And with that unseen attention, the carefully balanced order of her life was about to shift. Lucas Kellen entered Violet Hayes' life quietly, so quietly that at first it felt like coincidence. That was unusual, because there was nothing subtle about Lucas as a man. He was confident in the way people with expectations tend to be, comfortable taking up space, used to rooms adjusting to him. But with Violet, he didn't push. He didn't interrupt her focus. He didn't announce himself. He didn't flirt. He simply appeared. One evening in the university library in Chicago, Violet was seated at her usual table, surrounded by open books and handwritten notes. Her phone was face down, forgotten. Her attention was fixed, complete. Lucas approached with coffee in one hand and a thin folder tucked beneath his arm. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "Is the seat across from you taken?" His tone wasn't hesitant. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being answered with yes. Violet looked up briefly. She assessed him in seconds. The posture, the confidence, the expectation that lived just beneath the politeness. She nodded once. Then she went back to her notes. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Lucas was studying business administration, but unlike most students around him, he didn't speak about grades or exams. He spoke about outcomes, about leverage, about strategy as something meant to be applied, not admired. He talked about systems the way other people talked about dreams. He'd grown up in New Jersey, in a family where dinner conversations revolved around contracts, partnerships, and reputation. His father's company had once held real influence, and Lucas had been raised with the quiet pressure of restoring it, not as a hope, as a responsibility. At first, their conversation stayed practical. He asked about coursework, about economic models that didn't fully align in his mind. Violet explained patiently, clearly, without simplifying herself. She didn't perform intelligence. She didn't seek approval. She treated him like an equal. That unsettled him in the best way. Lucas began noticing details. The way Violet never checked her phone while studying. The way her notes were structured by logic instead of memorization. The way she paused before answering, choosing precision over speed. To him, this wasn't just intelligence. It was discipline, control, efficiency. Their study sessions became regular without either of them naming it. Lucas started arriving with coffee, always the same order Violet quietly bought for herself during breaks. He never asked if it was right. It always was. They talk about markets, corporate collapses, long-term investment strategy. Lucas spoke about the future with certainty, like it was a place already reserved for him. Violet listened. She questioned assumptions. She offered insight without competing. Slowly, collaboration turned into admiration, then into presence. They began meeting outside the library, small cafes near the older parts of Chicago, places where conversation stayed low and no one lingered long enough to be remembered. Lucas preferred seats near windows, watching people pass. Students, he'd say, workers, tourists, opportunities. Violet preferred corner tables, where she could see everything without being seen. Their dates were restrained, grounded, quiet, evening walks, shared coffee, simple meals, soup, roasted vegetables, bread dipped in olive oil. No spectacle, no displays, no performance. Lucas understood image. Romance, to him, was something managed, not advertised. Still, even early on, differences surfaced. Lucas spoke often about his future, never vaguely. His company, his expansion plans, his intention to reclaim his family status. When he spoke about success, it sounded inevitable. Violet was always included, but never centered. She was perspective, support, someone who sharpened his thinking. You see things other people don't, he told her once during a walk by the river. That changes outcomes. She smiled politely but felt uneasy. To Violet, intelligence wasn't currency. It was responsibility. As the relationship deepened, Lucas' admiration became more visible. He praised her openly, sometimes in front of others, always emphasizing her mind. Violet accepted the compliments, but noticed what was missing. He rarely spoke about her kindness, her steadiness, her values. What he admired most always tied back to what she provided. Lucas didn't ask much about her family. He assumed modesty, scholarships, discipline. It fit neatly into the image he'd built. Violet noticed, but interpreted his distance as respect. Emotionally, she remained cautious. She observed him carefully. She noticed how present he was when conversations aligned with his goals, how his attention drifted when emotions entered the room, how confidence sometimes slid quietly into assumption. And yet, she was drawn to him. There was comfort in being valued for her mind, security in his decisiveness, even when it felt rigid. He brought structure, direction, momentum. She brought depth, patience, balance. Affection developed slowly, not dramatically, not overwhelmingly. It settled. Lucas began holding her hand without hesitation. He introduced her to a small circle of friends, always emphasizing her intelligence. Violet felt chosen, but that feeling carried unease she couldn't yet explain. The imbalance was subtle. Lucas didn't dominate her choices. He didn't dismiss her opinions. He simply assumed alignment, assumed she would walk beside him, following the path he had already drawn. One evening, seated near an old stone bridge, Lucas spoke at length about acquisitions, partnerships, recovery. When he finished, he looked at her. "What do you think?" Violet paused, then spoke honestly. She mentioned risks he hadn't considered, weaknesses expansion wouldn't solve. Lucas listened, then smiled. "That's why I need you," he said. The words stayed with her. By then, she knew she had begun to love him, not blindly, not impulsively, but sincerely. Still, beneath that love lived something quieter, a tension she couldn't name, a sense that even while he stood beside her, his gaze was always forward, and somewhere between admiration and usefulness, between partnership and positioning, the balance of power began to shift, slowly, almost invisibly, toward him. The proposal came without spectacle, exactly the way Lucas Kellen preferred important things to be handled. He chose a small, quiet restaurant along the Malibu coastline, overlooking the Pacific, but far enough from the crowded resorts to preserve privacy. It was late afternoon, the hour when the light softens and conversations naturally grow quieter. The table was simple. No flowers beyond what the restaurant usually kept. No audience. Just 2 plates of grilled fish, warm bread torn by hand, and olive oil poured carefully into a shallow dish. Lucas had planned everything with precision. The place was orderly, calm, and perfectly aligned with what he believed Violet Hayes' world to be. Not so modest that it felt careless. Not so luxurious that it raised questions. It fit the image he had built of her, disciplined, intelligent, understated. At first, they talked about ordinary things. University deadlines, the heat of summer, a project Lucas was preparing for the next semester. Violet noticed his restlessness before he said anything. He was quieter than usual, his confidence drawn inward, as if he were measuring timing instead of emotion. When the plates were cleared, Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small velvet box on the table between them. He didn't kneel. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her with a seriousness she had only seen when he spoke about decisions he considered final. "You've made me better," he said. "More focused, more strategic. I don't want to build my future without you beside me." He opened the box. The ring was elegant, chosen with restraint and taste. A single stone, carefully selected. No excess. Exactly what someone would buy for a woman he respected, but believed lived simply. Violet felt the moment stretch. She looked at the ring, then at his face. There was sincerity there, but also something colder, a sense of closure, as if this were the final step of a plan he had already accepted. Her heart didn't race. It settled. She said yes, softly. Lucas smiled, more relieved than overwhelmed, and slid the ring onto her finger. He kissed her hand, then her cheek, carefully, making sure not to draw attention. To anyone watching, everything looked right, balanced, appropriate. Later that evening, as they walked along the shoreline, Violet felt the weight of the ring more than she expected. It wasn't heavy, but it anchored something inside her that was still uncertain. She told herself uncertainty was normal. Commitment always carried fear. The next day, she returned to Chicago, and that evening she called her parents. Raymond and Nadia Hayes answered together, as they often did. Violet told them calmly, without excitement, without hesitation. On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence. Raymond spoke first. "Does he know who you are?" he asked. Violet didn't need clarification. "No," she said. "He believes I'm exactly who I've shown him." Raymond inhaled slowly, not in disappointment, and not in approval, in calculation. "Then don't tell him yet," he said. "Not because it's wrong, but because it isn't finished." Nadia said nothing, but her eyes met Raymond's. She understood immediately. There were no formal explanations, no articulated plan, only an understanding that some truths reveal themselves only under pressure. Raymond didn't stop the engagement. He didn't celebrate either. He chose to observe. Violet accepted the silence. She trusted her father's instincts more than her own doubts. Wedding preparations began quietly. No engagement party. No public announcements beyond what was necessary. Lucas proposed a tasteful, restrained ceremony. He spoke about historic venues, spaces that signaled respect, not romance. Violet agreed without objection. As the weeks passed, she noticed how emotionally distant the entire process felt. Decisions were made efficiently. Dates were discussed like schedules. The guest list was trimmed strategically. There was no shared joy. No late-night conversations about colors or music. The wedding existed as an event, not a celebration. Lucas remained attentive, but focused. He spoke more about logistics than feelings. When Violet mentioned her parents, he nodded politely, but never insisted on meeting them. He didn't suggest visiting Montgomery, Alabama. He didn't propose a dinner together. At first, she told herself it was respect for boundaries. Later, she began to suspect it was disinterest disguised as courtesy. Her parents asked no further questions. Raymond continued his routine. Nadia quietly set aside linens, not because she expected to use them, but because preparation was part of her nature. Violet continued her days with the same discipline as before. University, library, cafes. But something inside her changed. She became more observant. She listened more carefully to what Lucas said and what he didn't. One evening, while reviewing venue options, she asked calmly if he wanted to meet her parents before the wedding. "There's time," he said lightly. "No need to rush. We'll do it properly." Properly, she understood, meant when it suited him. She didn't confront him. She didn't withdraw. She continued as always, calm and composed. But the quiet unease sharpened. Not enough to stop her, enough to prepare her. The engagement was official. The ring was worn. Plans moved forward. And somewhere beneath the surface, unseen and unspoken, the test had begun. Time was no longer neutral. It was moving towards something that would demand the truth, one way or another. The first dinner with the Kellen family was arranged with efficiency, not warmth. Lucas mentioned the invitation to Violet a few days in advance, presenting it as a formality, something that needed to be handled properly. His parents' home sat on the hills outside Malibu, California, far from the noise of the city, positioned to overlook the Pacific without being exposed to it. The house was large, meticulously maintained, and built to project a kind of success that had once never been questioned. They arrived just before sunset. The gate opened slowly at the touch of a keypad and closed behind them with a soft mechanical sound that made the property feel sealed off from the outside world. Violet adjusted her coat before stepping out of the car, aware of every detail, without feeling anxious. She had chosen her outfit carefully. Nothing new, nothing eye-catching, clean lines, neutral colors. She was dressed to disappear, not to impress. Margaret Kellen opened the door herself. She greeted Violet with a measured smile that never quite reached her eyes, kissed her lightly on both cheeks, then stepped back half a pace to look her over before saying anything else. Her gaze was practiced, quick, precise, lingering just long enough to register judgment without appearing impolite. Richard Kellen was already seated in the living room, a glass of untouched whiskey resting beside him. He stood when they entered, shook Violet's hand firmly, and nodded once. His eyes were sharp, observant, unhurried. He asked about the drive, the weather, her studies in Chicago. Each question was courteous, exact, and empty of real curiosity. Elaine Kellen joined them a little later, impeccably dressed, her smile light and well-rehearsed. She hugged Lucas warmly, then turned to Violet with a look that blended interest and appraisal. Her question sounded casual, but landed precisely. "Where exactly did you grow up? How long have you been in Chicago? Do you plan to work after the wedding?" Violet answered calmly, keeping her voice even, respectful but brief. She understood the rhythm of the conversation immediately. It wasn't designed to include her. It was designed to evaluate her. Dinner was served in a formal dining room, the table set with exact symmetry, the place settings aligned perfectly. The food was traditional but carefully curated. Slow roasted lamb, seasoned vegetables, homemade bread arranged in covered baskets. Everything tasted good. Nothing felt generous. Throughout the meal, Margaret led the conversation effortlessly, speaking often about the importance of family reputation, the value of marrying well, the way certain backgrounds require guidance. Her tone was pleasant, her words chosen carefully. Richard spoke less, adding occasional remarks about business, responsibility, knowing one's place in the world. Violet felt herself being weighed with every sentence. Her education was acknowledged, but always followed by a pause, as if something more impressive was expected to surface. When she mentioned Montgomery, Alabama, Elaine smiled thinly and nodded, as though confirming an assumption she had already made. Lucas sat beside Violet, attentive but restrained. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend her. He allowed the questions to pass through, responding only when addressed directly. Violet noticed that when she spoke, his eyes often shifted to his parents, measuring their reactions instead of focusing on her words. After dessert, Margaret suggested Violet might like to see the garden. She offered to show her personally. Violet declined politely, saying she preferred to stay inside. Margaret insisted gently, guiding her toward the hallway with a light but deliberate hand on her back. The gesture felt less like hospitality and more like removal. The moment Violet left the room, the tone changed. Richard spoke first, his voice low and direct. "This cannot be the woman you bring into this family without consequences." Margaret nodded. "She's polite, yes, educated, but she lacks presence. She doesn't carry weight. Her background doesn't align with ours." Elaine leaned back in her chair, dissatisfied. "People will ask questions. They already are." Lucas listened, his posture tightening slightly. He didn't look surprised. "You're not seeing it clearly," he said calmly. They turned toward him. "She's intelligent," he continued, "not just academically. Strategically, she sees patterns others miss. I've tested it many times." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And intelligence replaces pedigree now." "It replaces stagnation," Lucas replied. "You've said yourself the company is struggling." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Go on." Lucas spoke with confidence, explaining how Violet had helped him reframe problems, identify inefficiencies, anticipate outcomes. He described her not as a partner, but as an advantage, an asset that could be integrated quietly, used effectively, without drawing attention. "She expects nothing," he added. "She's grateful, humble. She knows this marriage elevates her position." The room grew quiet. Richard exchanged a glance with Margaret. Elaine considered the idea with interest, not disdain. "So she would work," Richard said slowly. "Advise, support." "Yes," Lucas said. "No ego, no demands." Margaret's expression shifted. "And she understands her place?" "She will," Lucas replied. "She already does." Richard nodded once. "Then the engagement can proceed, but with conditions." When Violet returned, she felt a change immediately. The air was lighter, the smiles more controlled. Margaret offered her tea. Elaine asked about her coursework with renewed interest. Richard addressed her directly, praising her discipline. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. On the drive home, Lucas seemed pleased. He spoke about the evening as if it had gone well. Violet listened in silence, feeling the distance that had quietly settled between them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't seek reassurance. She understood now. She hadn't been accepted. She had been approved. And not as a future wife, but as a calculated investment. Raymond Hayes made the call on an ordinary morning. One of those mornings that pass unnoticed by the world, except for the lives that are quietly rearranged beneath them. He was seated at the small wooden table in his home in Montgomery, Alabama, a cup of strong coffee cooling beside him, a stack of documents aligned neatly but still untouched. Outside, the street followed its usual rhythm. Nothing hinted at disruption. That was how Raymond preferred it. He dialed Richard Kellen's private number without hesitation. Richard answered cautiously. He recognized the name immediately, even if he didn't yet understand the reason for the call. Men like Richard lived in a constant state of readiness, especially when opportunity arrived without warning. Raymond introduced himself simply. No titles, no implications. He spoke about expanding business interests along the Gulf Coast, about logistics hubs, about port-adjacent developments, about long-term contracts that required local partners with experience and reach. He mentioned figures without emphasis, letting them land naturally. The numbers alone were enough to take Richard's breath away. Within minutes, Richard's posture shifted. His voice sharpened, grew more focused. This wasn't speculation. It was a lifeline. They agreed to meet in person within days, choosing a neutral office outside the city, discreet, professional, controlled. Richard arrived early, dressed carefully, carrying folders filled with projections and property portfolios he hoped would impress. Raymond arrived precisely on time, alone, unadorned, composed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he did so with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The proposal was extraordinary, a multi-year development initiative that could restore the Kellen family business to relevance, and erase debts Richard had kept hidden even from his own family. This wasn't survival. It was resurrection. Richard didn't pretend otherwise. Then Raymond introduced a condition. He spoke of his daughter, a young woman, intelligent, carefully protected. She had expressed interest in Richard's son after reviewing his profile during preliminary inquiries. She was open to meeting him, to considering marriage if compatibility allowed. Raymond did not mention her name. He gave no details. He stated only that the contract depended on this personal consideration. Richard immediately recognized the strategic angle. Marriage as leverage was not foreign to him. Alliances had always been part of advancement. He asked practical questions, timeline, expectations, discretion. Raymond answered only what was necessary. Richard left the meeting energized and unsettled. He had secured an opportunity beyond imagination. Now he had to act without hesitation. That evening he summoned Lucas home. Lucas arrived uneasy, sensing something significant was unfolding. Richard poured himself a drink and motioned for his son to sit. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "This changes everything," Richard said. "Our position, our future." He explained the deal carefully, watching Lucas's face as the scale became clear. Billions over time, influence restored, their name secured. Lucas's mind moved fast. This was everything he had been working toward. Then Richard mentioned condition. "A marriage," he said, "with his daughter." Lucas frowned slightly. "I'm engaged." Richard dismissed the concern. "Engagements end." Lucas stiffened. "Violet." Richard raised a hand. "Think." He laid it out plainly. Violet was intelligent. Yes, useful even, but she brought nothing beyond that. No power, no reach, no inheritance. What stood before them now was security for generations. "You have a choice," Richard said calmly. "A capable woman who helps you think, or an alliance that makes you untouchable." Lucas stood and began to pace. His jaw tightened as calculations formed behind his eyes. He didn't speak of love. He didn't mention loyalty. He spoke of optics, of consequences. "What's the plan?" he asked finally. Richard didn't soften the answer. "The wedding goes forward," he said. "You don't cancel it. That invites speculation. Weakness. You end it publicly. At the altar." Lucas stopped pacing. "You humiliate her," Richard continued. "Make it clear she was a mistake, that she was beneath us, that you realize it in time. It preserves our image." The cruelty of the words hung in the air. Lucas said nothing for a long moment. He imagined the scene, not emotionally but practically. The shock, the message, the finality. "And then," he asked. "Then," Richard said, "you're free. The other family sees your commitment. The contract moves forward." Something tightened in Lucas's chest, but it wasn't guilt. It was risk assessment. Violet would be hurt, yes, but pain passes. Opportunities like this do not return. "She'll recover," Richard added, as if reading his thoughts. "Women like her always do." Lucas exhaled slowly. He thought of Violet's quiet nature, her discipline, her restraint. He had always admired those qualities. He also knew they would prevent her from making a scene, from resisting publicly. That made the plan viable. "All right," Lucas said at last. "We proceed." The decision settled heavily, but clearly. Richard nodded once, satisfied. That night, he contacted Raymond Hayes, confirming that his son was interested and that any prior commitment would be resolved conclusively during the wedding ceremony itself. Raymond listened without reaction. He replied only that he understood, and the silence that followed was deliberate. The cathedral stood just outside the city, built from pale stone that caught the morning light and reflected it softly into the square. Age gave it authority. Height gave it presence. People instinctively lowered their voices the moment they stepped inside, as if the walls themselves demanded restraint. By mid-morning, the courtyard was full. Cars lined the narrow road. Guests arrived dressed with care, greeting one another with measured smiles, fully aware they were attending an event meant to be remembered. Inside, white flowers lined the aisle. Simple, intentional. A faint scent of incense lingered in the air, mixed with the coolness of stone. Light poured in through tall windows and settled gently over the wooden pews. It was a space chosen for symbolism, not warmth. Public, dignified, impossible to ignore. Violet Hayes stood in a small side room, her dress resting perfectly on her shoulders. It fit not because it was extravagant, but because it had been chosen with precision. Her hair was styled simply. The veil lay lightly, secured with care. She looked at herself in the mirror without judgment, only observation. On the surface, she felt calm. Beneath it, something shifted, like ground that hadn't fully settled. She thought briefly of her parents. They had arrived separately that morning, composed and quiet, speaking little. Her father had held her hands longer than usual. Her mother had adjusted the veil with careful fingers. Neither had spoken of emotions. That silence stayed with her now. When the doors opened and the music began, Violet stepped forward. She walked down the aisle alone, exactly as planned. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. She felt eyes on her, measuring, admiring, questioning. She kept her gaze forward, fixed on the altar where Lucas Kellen stood. He was upright, controlled, his expression unreadable. Not nervous, not emotional. Still, as she approached, unease sharpened. He didn't smile. He didn't extend his hands until the last moment, and when he did, his grip was cold. She told herself it was nerves. Public moments unsettled everyone, even confident men. The ceremony began. The officiant's voice echoed softly through the space, steady and formal. Words about commitment and union filled the air. Familiar, expected. Violet listened carefully, grounding herself in the sound of each sentence, focusing on meaning rather than atmosphere. Then Lucas let go of her hands. The sound was small, almost nothing, but the movement was immediate. The officiant paused, confused. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the front rows. "I need to stop this," Lucas said. His voice carried clearly, unwavering. It reached the back of the cathedral without effort. Violet turned slowly toward him, her heart now pounding without restraint. She searched his face for explanation, for doubt, for anything that suggested this was a mistake. "I can't marry you," he continued. This was a mistake. A murmur spread through the guests. Someone inhaled sharply. The officiant stepped back, unsure of his role now. "What are you saying?" Violet asked quietly. Lucas did not lower his voice. "You were never right for this family," he said. "You were never part of this world. I tried to convince myself otherwise, but I was wrong." The words hit with physical force. Heat rose to her face, then drained away. Her legs remained steady only because she forced them to. Before she could speak again, Margaret Kellen stood. "Let's be honest," she said, her tone sharp and precise. "Did you really think you were equal to us? Look around. This is not your world." Elaine Kellen followed immediately, rising with a thin smile devoid of warmth. "We all knew this would end today," she said. "We were just waiting to see how long it would take you to realize it." A laugh came from the front rows, nervous at first, then louder, emboldened by the confidence with which the words were spoken. Richard Kellen stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. "This was a business arrangement," he announced. "And it's over." The words slammed into the stone walls. Violet felt herself become the center of something ugly. No longer a bride, an exhibit. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her throat tightened. Her thoughts scattered. Then came the first splash. Cold water struck her shoulder and slid down the fabric of her dress. She flinched, not from the sensation, but from the intent. Another followed almost immediately. Champagne this time, sticky and sharp-smelling, soaking her veil. Hands reached for her, pulling, tearing. The veil snapped and fell to the floor. "Know your place," someone said. A shove from behind knocked her off balance. Her knees slammed into the stone. The sound was dull, absorbed by the space, but the impact shot through her body. She stayed there, palms pressed the floor, her dress spread around her, soaked, ruined. The humiliation was complete, intentional, calculated. Around her, reactions fractured. Some guests stood immediately and left, unable to stay. Others froze, eyes wide, unsure whether to intervene. A few lifted their phones, recording in stunned silence. No one spoke loudly enough to challenge what was happening. Lucas stood over her, unmoving. "You were useful," he said flatly, "but I don't need you anymore." The words landed with finality. There was no apology, No hesitation, only closure. Violet's vision blurred. She felt the cold stone beneath her hands. Unforgiving. Her chest tightened not with tears, but disbelief. The man she had trusted stood detached, as if she were no longer human to him. She did not scream. She did not beg. Her silence became another spectacle, misread as weakness by those watching. The officiant had retreated far back, his face pale. The flowers lining the aisle looked absurd now, untouched, pristine. The Kellen family stood together, satisfied. The display had gone exactly as planned. Then the doors at the far end of the cathedral opened. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the space with authority. Heads turned instinctively. Conversations died mid-breath. Two figures entered, moving with purpose, accompanied by men who did not look like guests. Their very posture commanded attention. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. From her position on the floor, Violet lifted her head, and in that moment, everything stopped. Raymond Hayes and Nadia Hayes entered the cathedral without haste. They did not rush toward the altar. They did not raise their voices. They did not look around to see who was watching. Their authority came from the way they moved, measured, composed, unquestionable. The men accompanying them stopped several steps behind, calm and alert, deliberately unobtrusive. Nothing about the moment felt improvised. From the floor, Violet saw her parents clearly for the first time since the doors had opened. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition. The calm on her father's face was the same calm she had known her entire life, the kind that appeared only when decisions had already been made and could no longer be undone. Raymond approached first. He asked no questions. He did not look at the people who had surrounded his daughter moments earlier. He simply bent slightly and extended his hand. When Violet took it, his grip was firm, steady, grounding. He helped her to her feet without urgency, then removed his jacket and placed it carefully over her shoulders, shielding her from the soaked dress and from the eyes still fixed on her. Only then did he turn. "My name is Raymond Hayes," he said. His voice was low, even, and carried effortlessly through the cathedral. There was no anger in it, no threat. The effect was immediate. Richard Kellen's posture stiffened. Margaret Kellen's face drained of color. Elaine Kellen stopped smiling. "I have stood in silence and watched," Raymond continued, "while my daughter was insulted, assaulted, and publicly humiliated." A murmur moved through the guests, sharper now, uneasy. Several phones were lowered instinctively. Raymond's gaze settled on Richard. "You treated her like a transaction," he said. "Something to be tested, used, and discarded. You miscalculated." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that day, uncertainty showed openly on his face. Raymond took his phone from his pocket. He did not lower his eyes as he spoke, giving clear, precise instructions. He mentioned contracts, timelines, clauses prepared long in advance. Company names, accounts, and ongoing negotiations were referenced briefly, without explanation. The call lasted less than a minute. When he ended it, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Effective immediately, he said, "Every agreement involving your company is suspended. Audits will begin today. Investigations will follow." The words landed heavily. Richard staggered slightly, gripping the back of a pew for support. "That's not possible," he said weakly. "It is," Raymond replied, "and it's already in motion." Police officers stepped forward from the back of the cathedral, their presence now unmistakable. They moved with purpose, quietly. One of them spoke clearly, announcing arrest for assault and public disorder. The Kellen family erupted. Margaret protested, her composure collapsing. Elaine shouted accusations at anyone near her. Richard tried to explain, to negotiate, to regain control with words that no longer carried weight. Lucas Kellen stood frozen until reality fully struck him. Then he tried to move forward, ignoring the officers. "Violet," he said urgently, "please, I didn't know. If I had known who your father was." She turned slowly toward him. Her face was pale, but her expression was clear. "That's the problem," she said. "You only care now because you know who he is." He reached for her arm. She stepped back. "You didn't hesitate," she continued. "Not when you planned it. Not when you watched it happen. That tells me everything I need to know. Lucas's voice cracked. I was under pressure. My family. You made your choice, she said, and now you live with it. Raymond stepped slightly in front of her, not threatening, just present. The officers took Lucas by the arm and led him away, his protest dissolving into stunned silence. Around them, the guests stood motionless. Some whispered, some stared, some wiped tears, ashamed they hadn't intervened sooner. The flowers, the decorations, the altar, everything suddenly felt meaningless. Nadia Hayes stepped forward then, her movements gentle but firm. She smoothed Violet's hair where it had been disturbed, tightened the jacket around her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. "Let's go home," she said softly. Violet nodded. As they walked down the aisle together, the same aisle she had entered with Hope just hours earlier, the space felt different, lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because it was no longer hidden. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted. The square was quieter now. Guests stood in small, uncertain clusters, watching as the Hayes family walked away. No one spoke. Violet did not look back. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel relieved. She felt something steadier than both. Clarity. She lost a wedding. She lost an idea of love she once believed in. But she gained something more durable. She saw the truth without illusion. She faced humiliation without losing herself. As the car pulled away from Cathedral and a quiet landscape stretched ahead, Violet rested her head against the window. The road before her was open and calm. She was not broken. She was free. And now she knew with absolute certainty. Respect is never conditional. Those who reduce people to value will eventually be destroyed by the very calculations they trust most.